In order to understand how to convert a decimal value to a whole number, you need to understand how variables and data types work in Swift. A variable allows your app to remember things. Think of a variable as a temporary storage container for a single piece of data, like this image of a hat that I put a cute creature in. You don't just put stuff in the container and then forget about it. You will often replace its contents with a new value later on. For example, maybe you want to put a rabbit in the hat instead. That's the whole point behind variables. They can vary. For example, the slider value state variable that you created earlier will change every time the slider is moved. You configure each variable to store a certain type of data. For example, the hat stores cute creatures. You can think of variables like children's toy blocks. The idea is to put the right shape into the right container. The container is the variable, and its type determines what shape fits. The shapes are all the possible values that you can put into the variables. Let's look at the syntax to create a variable in Swift. If this variable is a property on a SwiftUI view, you can add the @state keyword. When you add this keyword, it tells Swift that this variable contains important app state. And remember, anytime a state variable changes, SwiftUI will automatically recompute the body of the view so that your body is always up to date with the app state. If this variable is a property on a class or a struct, you can optionally put private, and that will mark it as private, only accessible by the particular class or struct. You'll learn more about what this impacts as well as other options that you can choose besides private later on in this learning path, but for now, just know that it's best practice to mark any state variable private. The first required element is the keyword var, which is short for variable, and it means that it can change. In contrast, if you know the variable will not change, you can use the keyword let instead. We'll talk more about var versus let later in this course. For now, just know that sometimes we'll use var and sometimes we'll use let. But they both store data. You then enter the name of the variable. You can name a variable anything you like as long as you avoid special keywords in Swift like var or func. Usually in Swift, it's best practice to name your variables with camel case, which means you start it in lowercase, and if your variable has multiple words, the first letter of any subsequent word is uppercased. But that's just a best practice, and in the end, it's up to you. You then enter a colon and enter the type of the variable. For example, one type you've worked with already is bool, which is a variable that can either be true or false. Finally, and optionally, you can set the variable to an initial value. For example, here's the line of code we just wrote to create a variable to store the slider's value. This variable stores part of the app state, so we mark it with @state, and it's named slider value. The type is double, which means we can store double values, that is decimal values like 3.1415, into this variable. We could not store a string value into this variable because we marked it as double, not string. You may wonder how you can convert this one type to another. For example, we want to convert this double value into a whole number, which is called an int in Swift. Well, if you try to simply assign the double to the int, you'll get an error. This is because Swift says, hey, wait a minute, this is an int-shaped container and you can't just put a double into it. This is a good thing as it helps you prevent mistakes in your coding, and it's actually called type safety. So instead, you have to be explicit about your conversions. It turns out that you can create a new int given a double value like you see here. This conversion discards any of the decimal component, so in this case, you would simply get 3. This process of converting from one type to another is sometimes called casting. You can think of it like casting a Harry Potter style magic spell to convert one type to another. Expecto convertum. There's one last thing I'd like to mention. I said that a variable is a temporary storage container, but how long will it store its contents? Well, each variable has a certain lifetime that depends on exactly where in your program you define that variable. In this case, slider value will stick around for just as long as its owner, content view, does. Their fates are intertwined. The content view and thus slider value are there for the duration of the app. They don't get destroyed until the app quits. There are also variables that are short-lived variables, known as local variables. Later on, I'll show you how you can add a local variable to your app. The concept of how long a variable lives is often called scope, and we'll talk more about that and how that works later in this course. For now, all you need to know is that whenever the user moves the slider, SwiftUI automatically updates slider value with the current value of the slider, so they always match. And when we display the alert, we can access the latest value. All right, that's enough about theory. Let's go back to the code. All right, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to convert the slider value, which is a double, in other words, a number with decimal points, to an integer value, which has no decimal points. So what we need to do here is we need to create a new variable. So type in var, and we're going to call it rounded value. And we're going to use camel casing here, which means start lowercase, and then every new word starts with the uppercase letter. Then we're going to put colon, and we're going to say this is a variable of type int or integer. And then we set equal to an initial value, which we're going to put int and in parentheses. And this allows us to convert a double value to an integer. And so inside these parentheses, we're going to pass the double value we want to convert, which is self.sliderValue. Okay, so now we're going to modify our message a little bit, and we're going to print out both the original slider value with decimal points, and we're also going to print out the rounded value. So the slider's value is slider's value, and then before the period here, we're going to say in rounded value is, and then we're going to use string interpolation again. So backslash, 2 parentheses, and inside there, we're going to put in rounded value. So this time we don't need to put the self dot beforehand because the rounded value is within the scope of these 2 parentheses. So this is what's called local scope, and in this case, we don't need the self dot, whereas these other properties were properties on the content view. So that's why we need to use self dot, which indicates the current instance. All right, let's run this for a second and see what's going on so far. So Command R to run. I'm going to drag it somewhere, type in hit me, and I can see here that we have the long decimal number and then we have a truncated integer number here. But let me just drag a little bit more here. I want to show you something. Okay, so check this out. We see the slider's value is 84.55. So if it's truly a rounded value, this should be 85, not 84, right? But when you're using this way of converting, it's actually just truncating it. It's not rounding it. So let's see how we can actually make it rounded instead. Remember that Xcode has some great built-in developer documentation. And often if you want to see what something is, you can hold down Option and this little question mark will come up and it'll give you dynamic help based on what you click on. So if I click on slider value, it will say what this is. And it's saying, hey, you're looking at a property called slider value, which is returning a double. And as I move my mouse over different things here, sometimes I can click to get more information. So I can click on double and it'll take me straight to the documentation for double. And this will let me see different things I can do with double values, like creating random numbers, creating square roots. And if I scroll down, whoa, this looks like what we want. There's a method we can call on double that will return us a rounded version of the double value. So for example, if I had 56.7 and I called rounded on it, it would give me 57 in that case. So that's what we want. So after slider value, we're going to put dot and we're going to start it typing in round and then just hit enter, autocomplete will pick it up. So to sum up what's going on here is if we have a value like 56.7, which is a double, self.slider value rounded will make it self.57.0, and then we call int, it'll cut off the 0.0 and just make it an integer of 57, which is exactly what we want. So let's try this out with Command R. Move this somewhere. Okay, here's a great example. It's 80.68, and now it's rounded to 81, which is exactly what we want. And so now that we have it working the way we want, we can clean this up a little bit. So we can just say the slider's value is rounded value and delete all this other stuff. We don't need it anymore. And run it one more time just to make sure it works. 89, I'll just try to drag it around there. And I got 88, pretty good.